So I want to welcome the Right Honourable Greg Clark. Greg is the Member of Parliament for Tunbridge Wells. In the last government, he was the Cabinet Secretary for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and earlier this year was elected as Chair of the Commons Science and Technology Committee. Welcome, Greg. We very much look forward to hearing what you have to say. Ladies and gentlemen, come on.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen, and thanks for bringing this together and sharing it. And thanks also to Mark Downs and Stephen Benn from the Royal Society of Biology for this amazing event. I feel very fortunate to be chairing the Science and Technology Select Committee of Parliament, especially at this time. One of the things that I hoped we'd be able to do together was to help raise the profile of science and technology in Parliament and beyond. And well, we've had a bit of help from the coronavirus in that. And I think it really has engaged more people in science than probably ever thought they would be interested in science. There's sometimes been a bit of sneering criticism of armchair epidemiologists. We've all heard a bit of that. But I agree with what Tim Harford said on More or Less. I know David Spiegel had made mention of him earlier. More or Less extended by popular demand from 7 episodes on Radio 4 to 14. And he said that this term, armchair epidemiologists, sounds like a compliment to him. And I think it is good that people are taking interest. Vast numbers of the population, I think, have been exposed perhaps more consistently day after day and for longer to scientific discourse and to scientists than we might have ever previously appreciated. Epidemiologists certainly, but virologists, physicians and medics, behavioral scientists. The big questions: how does the virus transmit itself? What statistically? What are our comparators? How we're doing against other countries? What type of people does it affect? In what circumstances? Does social distancing work? And what types of measures? These are all big questions of science, but also of public policy, in which there's been a big interest. And I think, and there's been some discussion in this meeting this morning about the organisation of the press conferences. But I think to have Sir Patrick and Chris Whitty there answering questions from the public, as well as on behalf of the public from journalists, has been a very good piece of scientific communication. And as one of your previous speakers said, I want to acknowledge and praise the work of the Science Media Centre, who have been working flat out to ensure that there is a wide range of top scientific opinion available to inform the media right throughout this pandemic. And sparing Sir Patrick's blushes and Chris, there have been lots of other scientists that have come to prominence during this. And in fact, most of them are certainly more familiar faces than many of us in politics these days. And I think that is a good thing. And my impression is that science is emerging through this, perhaps better understood, better communicated, and retaining and indeed enhancing its respect. Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty are palpably people of integrity and capability. I think everyone seeing the way they conduct themselves sees that. In fact, I would say that there's been a rehabilitation of the role of experts and the respect that we have for experts, and not before time, in my view. And this is so even when, as is obvious to everyone, the experience of the last few months has been a very painful one for this country. This has not been a set of events in which we we've done much better than expected. There have been difficult choices. And I think for it to have emerged in this way so far, with respect enhanced, is notable. And I think it shows that people have in this country, a capability for an adult understanding of scientific discourse. First of all, has been alluded to, I think there's no doubt that everyone watching recognizes that everyone involved is motivated by the highest of ideals and is working exceptionally hard in the public interest nationally and internationally. I think there is an acceptance that no one, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, knows the answer to all of the questions, and many of those answers only emerge over time, and that some of the initial answers or attempts at answers will not be permanently the right answers. All science is provisional, to be tested against the evidence. And I think there is a quite sophisticated understanding that not everything will not be perfect foresight at every stage in this. I think there is realism, but at the same time some excitement about the breakthroughs that might be possible, whether they're in vaccines or in treatments. And the fact that some of the disappointments that we have encountered on the way, such as, for example, that there is a continuing question about whether antibodies confer continuing immunity. If we discovered that actually they did earlier on, then clearly that would have been better, but I think people have been adult and realistic about that. And finally, I think people do understand the nature of scientific disagreement. Sir Patrick is speaking next, and my committee has not been flinching in its questions. We've been challenging, in I hope, the scientific way, not so much pitting one expert against another, but hearing from a variety of different perspectives to consider them, to ask tough questions, but for the purposes of elucidating what are the thoughts and the emerging views behind that. It's been very gratifying that the sessions of our committee have been carried live not just on Parliament TV, but at times the whole session on Sky News and BBC. Such has been the level of interest in this. So in terms of the question of today, I do think that the level of trust and confidence in science is certainly surviving and I think being built on during the crisis. There was a paper that was published on the 2nd of June that predicted that trust in science would be negatively impacted by this pandemic based on the history of other pandemics. But I don't think that seems to be the case. One aspect that I think is important and has been touched on before is the commitment to transparency. As Venki Ramakrishnan said, there are clearly some emergencies that have to be kept secret all the time, and they engage questions of national security as the poisonings in Salisbury did. But I would like to commend in particular Sir Patrick for his response to the case that my committee pressed for transparency, publishing the names of those people that had attended SAGE, publishing regularly the papers. As we thought and expected, publishing the names didn't lead to a chorus of disapproval. Actually, it was impressive the breadth of scientific advice that was there. And equally, publishing the scientific papers, as is the nature of scientific discourse, allows people to review, to consider, and to critique them. So I think it has been, the right steps have been taken in terms of how we use science. Now, clearly this is going to be important beyond the pandemic. I think we are going to see an increased role for science in public policy. not least because we have a big and expanding budget for science that is now in prospect, and that's something that I welcome. Stephen mentioned that I was the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and that included the science base. I was very proud during my tenure there, when we launched the industrial strategy, to increase the annual science and R&D budget, the public R&D budget, from 9 billion to 12 billion pounds a year, an increase of a third. It was the biggest we'd had up to that date, and was taking us out of a flat cash world. But the March budget, much eclipsed by the subsequent events, made a commitment not just to move from 9 billion to 12 billion, but to move to 22 billion pounds a year by 2024. So that is a massive increase. Now, my select committee will be inquiring very closely into making sure that is delivered, and that we make rapid progress towards the 2.4% ambition that I also set in the industrial strategy. And there are questions as to how it's used. We'll be looking at the proposed new ARPA agency. But this is a context in which I think we're going to see an increasingly high profile for science and science policy in this country. So with a long way to go during the pandemic, and with, of course, the need, as science does, to look back and to consider what we could have done better and what we can do better in future, an absolutely essential discipline that, again, my committee will play a prominent part in. I hope and expect that we will see science continue to strengthen its prominence in our national life.
Great. Thank you very much indeed for that. Perhaps if I could just ask a question around the role of select committees. Do you think that this pandemic has enhanced the role of select committees in Parliament and their, the attention you've been receiving? How are we going to build on that and ensure that it continues in the future once the pandemic's passed?
Well, as I say, I think it has been gratifying that the hearings have attracted so much attention, and I'm grateful to people like Sir Patrick for having appeared regularly before the committee, appearing again this week. Knowing that there's a lot on their plate, it's still, I think, necessary to learn the lessons on the way, including those that can be applied in the rest of the pandemic. And I think that has been appreciated. And something that you will know and she will know as fellow parliamentarians, there is something unique about a select committee's ability to ask questions. If you have a question in the chamber, you get one question. And actually in the press conferences, the press were limited to one main question and sometimes a supplementary. But actually, as we know, the subject under discussion, it's very difficult to capture the nuances in a single question. So the ability to ask 10 relevant questions on a subject is something that I think is unique to a select committee. And if it's done in the right way, and I pay tribute to my colleagues on the committee, it's not, as Stephen, you've been served a long time on the select committee. The ethos is that we put aside party political differences. We're there to really try to get at the truth and to be constructive. And I think that certainly characterised the approach that we've taken.
Thank you for that. I mean, the Royal Society of Chemistry was interested to know whether or not, and from your experience of taking evidence during this time, that there is a sufficient understanding of an agreement from what the roles for ministers are, for scientists, researchers, and where the public fit in. Do you think that's understood, or is there more work to be done? And can you bring some clarity to who should be doing what, where, and when?
Well, I think we're going to try to do that. And Sir Patrick Vallance has been helpful and reflecting on this throughout, and obviously the publication of the sage names and the minutes is to draw a distinction between the scientific advice and decisions that are always taken by ministers. So reflecting back, I think, and Sir Patrick will speak for himself, but when we heard in evidence, not just from Sir Patrick, but many others, it was the case that in every material respect, the government had followed the main recommendations of SAGE. They didn't have to, there's a separate role, but they had done so. I do think that there is a question there, and it was raised by, I think, I think David Spiegelhalter, who said that actually, taking into account scientific advice and opinion may be the right guide, rather than being constrained to follow it in every respect. Because the truth is that there are policy decisions that need to draw on scientific advice, but they need to draw on the experience that ministers and others have in terms of administration, in terms of the impacts on other parts of society. And so I think one of the things that we will want to look at and will look at is the structure of scientific advice to government in this country. And I think it is, science always challenges itself, and it's right that it should be the case. And we have an exceptional science base in this country, and we've got perhaps a more organised system of giving advice in emergencies through SAGE than other countries. But I think one has to be candid and to reflect that so far our performance in terms of outcomes has not been exceptional in a good way, and so I think we do need to understand why that's the case.
Okay, thank you. I notice it's now 11:40. Have you got time for one quick final question?
Of course, yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. It's from Joseph Lewis and Gary Cass from the Institute of Environmental Services, Environmental Sciences, who basically want to know that we've made a lot of progress in the acceptance of scientific advice during this time. How do we embed that to ensure that decision makers and Parliament engages with science moving forward, particularly when it comes to the next set of big challenges, which will be around how we deal with our environment and the environmental challenge that we face, between now and reaching, net zero by 2030, 2050.
Absolutely. So I think we should draw on, and again, one of the reasons for inquiry into this is to how we can best make use of scientific advice. One thing that I would emphasise, and it's something that the committee has long championed, is the role of the chief scientific advisors in every government department. I think having a scientist and someone with a clear responsibility for being someone that can tap into a network, the network of scientists in academia and industry, and to make sure that they are central and influential in decision making is something that I'm very keen to press on the government, and I hope they'll be receptive to that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for your time this morning, for your very interesting words at the start, and for answering our questions so openly. Right on, Greg Clark, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.